It's almost midday. Good day, everybody. I want to give you some time back for lunch. And then I believe we are nearing the end of the conference. So we're gonna have a closing panel shortly. And then that will be followed by just closing remarks. If I may please have your attention. Thank you. All right, my name is Dumisani Mkhonza. I'm from Absa Corporate and Investment Banking. I am very privileged to be here this today. And I actually just have a disclaimer. So I was not part of that Absa team that put a 10-page document for our managing exec yesterday. But I'm in that area of public sector and growth capital solutions. So in my business, we work with our corporate clients in South Africa, also on the continent. We partner with them to develop SMEs in their value chains. So I've got an esteemed guest today, which I'm very proud of. And I will introduce them shortly. Their full bios are on the booklet. So I will start with Professor Rob Davies, other professor. He's an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at University of Cape Town. He's also a member of Trade and Industrial Development Advisory Council. Between 2009 and 2019, he was South Africa's Minister of Trade and Industry, and also as a member of Parliament for our first democratic election in '94, serving for over 25 years. Also, may I introduce Professor Faizel Ismail, hello, Prof, who is also a director at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, also at UCT. He has served as an ambassador, a permanent representative of South Africa's World Trade Organization between 2010 and 2014, and also South Africa's special envoy to the SA-USA AGOA negotiations. He's also written 3 books, which one of them is on AfCFTA. And then last but not least, Dr. Neva Makgetla, other doc. She's a senior economist at TIPS. She's done extensive research in South Africa economic issues that are published widely. She has contributed to a number of natural economic policy processes and debates. From '94 until 2015, she was a Deputy Director General at dtic of Economic Policy in Economic Development. She also has played various roles, one of them being head of COSATU Policy Unit, and she holds a PhD in economics and has been a lecturer herself. So you can see their full bios, very comprehensive, very experienced. So yeah, it's a privilege to have them today, just to talk to us about what has happened in the last 2 days. You know, the objective was to go quite deep into the issues. I think, you know, just from an overall sense, everybody wants to see a prosperous Africa. Everyone wants to empower Africa's tomorrow. And we can walk that journey in sharing the ideas, and also more importantly, in looking at how we're going to implement them. So, Prof. Rob, I'm gonna start with you. Just given the topic of green industrialization it's been quite topical today. Maybe you can share with us your thoughts of how we balance it, and how can it be a risk and an opportunity for the continent's free trade area and regional integration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation. Let me just say I've only been here today, but I've been impressed by the quality and rigor of the presentations, and particularly by young people, young researchers. I think it's TIPS deserves credit for organizing this forum. So let me just say that I think that my point of departure is that unless we move into higher value-added activities, unless we, as Adebayo Adedeji, who was the director of UNECA, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and the author of the African Alternative to Structural Adjustment Programs. Unless we break from the apron strings of dependence on the production and export of raw materials, this transition to a lower carbon economy will be highly unjust. It'll be highly unjust, not just because people are going to be losing jobs in high carbon activities, well, that's part of the story. It will be made even more unjust on the African continent because the African continent will be disproportionately affected by extreme weather events as global warming proceeds. That's what climate change is telling us. So I think that the whole issue of green industrial development is actually an existential issue for the African continent. Unless we industrialize as this transition unfolds, we're going to find ourselves not just standing still, but probably regressing in terms of, I think, many socioeconomic indicators. Now, I would want to say that I think there are really important strategic reasons why the Continental Free Trade Area is critical and central in that regard. So some of them are the long-term general issues about the Continental Free Trade Area. As a combined GDP, the CFTA would place Africa as the 8th largest economy in the world. Most of the Asian countries that are leading the charge in terms of industrializing, China and India, have been relying on their large domestic markets and the growing prosperity of their populations as key drivers, not just of industrialization, but also placing themselves at the forefront of innovation and you know, both in digital technologies as well as low carbon technologies. Now, the Continental Free Trade Area therefore provides us with an opportunity to have much deeper and also more inclusive industrialization than if we were trying to base ourselves on individual countries. I think that's the obvious point. Now, that's not going to happen, I don't believe, if we're just going to confine our horizon for the Continental Free Trade Area to a trade integration arrangement and a trade arrangement. So the reasons why intra-regional trade is low compared to other regions is not just because we've got tariffs or other regulations in place. It's because the productive capacity of the African continent is geared towards producing raw materials for the use in industries outside the continent, and the infrastructure was developed under colonialism and to a large extent remains orientated towards that reality. So it's productive capacity and its infrastructure. So I think that the issues of cooperation and coordination are critical. Now, I think those are the general long-term parameters around the Continental Free Trade Area. But more than that, I would want to say that the current global conjuncture is adding to the imperative for us to use coordination and cooperation within the Continental Free Trade Area. Now, why am I saying this? Well, first of all, the fact that we have critical minerals does not mean that we are going to get investments in raising the value addition of those minerals. The actual trend lines, if you look now, the lion's share of any investments are going to extract those for the benefit of industries outside, there's a scramble for Africa, new scramble for Africa around critical minerals. And it's all about getting access to raw materials on the continent. Now, I think that for us to be able to move up the value chain is going to require the deployment of policy tools. It's not good enough just to say we want to see more value addition and we don't want to see dirt out of the ground exported and leave it like that and trust that everyone else is just going to follow suit. We've got to deploy policy tools. Now, I think that the global conjuncture we're in now is opening up new possibilities to deploy those policy tools. What do I mean by that? World Trade Organization rules have been a barrier to us deploying policy tools of various sorts. Now those rules are being weakened and in fact jettisoned by the developed world for its own reasons. The United States, I think, has totally upended the system, but the European Union has also just ridden a coach and horses through the rules when it suits them. Some developing countries like Indonesia have taken advantage of the weakened enforcement to insist through export taxes that there will be they will not allow the export of nickel as a raw material. They're insisting on levels of beneficiation before export. And the information I've seen suggested that just from smelting, they got a 30-fold increase in value from the nickel value chain in the Indonesian economy. They were challenged in the WTO by the European Union. The European Union won its case in the panel, but then Indonesia appealed to the appellate body, which is disabled by the United States, and have been able to continue with this measure. I think that's an indication of where we go. That constraint has been weakened, and some developing countries have been able to use that to good advantage. I'm not saying we have to follow them exactly, but that we need to be negotiating, putting in place regulations, or putting in place export taxes. We've got to do something like that if we're going to force a movement up the value chain and leverage off our resource base. Another example, we're talking just now about component manufacturing for renewable energy. Well, you know, one of the things that the Biden administration did, the Inflation Reduction Act, was they offered an incentive, $15,000 tax incentive if you bought a battery manufactured in the United States. The European Union and others complained, and they said, oh, well, we'll extend it to everybody with whom we have a free trade agreement. Completely in violation of WTO rules. But they've established a precedent. And the precedent is that you can extend any local content rules, both to private sector transactions, which is against local WTO rules, and then on top of that, you can extend it to others with whom you have an FTA. Why can we not think about some variation of that to support the manufacture of components on the African continent, if not as a first choice, but maybe as a second choice? If we don't manufacture them in one country, the second preference goes to manufactured elsewhere on the continent. Third example is the CBAM. The European Union is going to impose a levy on top of a tariff. That's not supposed to happen. All levies were supposed to be tariffized, then subject to the bindings. The European Union has said climate overrides that, but no one's giving us any money of any significance anyway, for adaptation, and yet adaptation is a critical issue. So let's think about that. We can impose levies on CBAM implementing countries. By the way, the work done by the African Climate Foundation, a study that they did, said that even on the least ambitious scenario, the lowest carbon price and the least coverage, CBAM will have a negative effect on GDP and on export earnings by African countries, and that will be and the gains in terms of carbon will be minuscule. So I think that all of that is creating opportunities. On the other hand, we've got the exercise of raw power. That's what we've got. We have been told that you know, unless you want to have a prohibitive tariff or whatever it is by the United States, raw materials and critical minerals are a major issue. I think we can, if we come together and we send key messages together and we act in concert, and I think a lot of horses have bolted, to be honest, already, but there's still some that are still in the stable, and it's worth protecting those. So I think that this conjuncture is creating new imperatives for us to act regionally and to build regional value chains. The last point I would make is to say that we've got to protect and defend the continental free trade area against the new challenges that are coming from the emerging conjuncture. What are those? Well, first of all, it is now objectively more difficult to enter the markets of the US. In the EU, it's a rising floor of climate-justified standards. And I think that, you know, even if you wanted to, the opportunity of moving into competitive manufacturing by exporting to the global north is becoming more and more difficult. And so everyone and his dog is going to be looking to diversify. I don't think the African area is going to be the most important, but it's going to be one area. And what we've got to do is we've got to defend the integrity of the continental free trade area against a potential influx of finished products from people who are dissatisfied or unable to trade in the same way they've done with the developed world. And that, I think, is going to have to lead us to say that, and have a coherent and consistent message. The way you benefit as a third party from the continental free trade area is not that we're just going to extend all the benefits of the CFTA to you, the trade benefits, is through investment-led trade. If you come and invest, establish productive capacity, you will qualify under the rules of origin, because the rules of origin apply to domicile, not national ownership, and you will then be able to benefit in that way. And I think we've got to send out some consistent messages like that, as well as to accelerate the work on building the regional value chain. So I think that unless we do all of this, this transition to the low carbon economy is likely to be highly unjust. Borrowing money from people that are looking for massive rates of return, or offering us supposedly cheap loans when we bear all the foreign exchange risks, and this is used for a little bit of social responsibility investment, but largely to support projects where their industries will benefit, or we're supplying fuels, we're supplying basic commodities, I think is not going to take us forward. We've really got to come together as a continent, and we've got to accelerate our efforts to industrialize. That's what I would say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you. That was comprehensive, you know, and as you speak, I'm thinking, I'm hearing a lot of Africa First there, Prof. So thank you very much. I think this is quite a nice segue then to Prof. Faizel, just because we want to also tackle the developmental regionalism item. It was spoken about a lot yesterday, but firstly, maybe you can just define it for us, or redefine it for us, Prof, and then just make us understand, you know, how do we do it in practice on the continent?
Thank you very much. So first, I want to also say how pleased I am to be part of this gathering today, and thanks to TIPS really for hosting this event, but also it's great to see so many people doing research, serious research, and discussing issues related to regional integration. Some former students of mine I'm pleased to see as well. So this is great. So I think the first thing I want to underline, one of the points Rob made, is that regional integration in Africa has always been a necessity for most countries on the African continent, because we're just too small. We can't compete. The only way we can add value to our raw materials and resources is if we collaborate with our neighbors. That has been the case for most countries, but in the recent period, it has become absolutely clear also to most South African businesses and South African industries that they need the African market. And this was just even before the current context of you know, a fragmenting global economy and a very hostile trading environment in the you know, major markets in the north. Now it has become even more compelling. What we have before us, we should really congratulate ourselves for and be proud of. We have accomplished as a continent the building of one of the most comprehensive free trade agreements in the world. And we've done it, you know, in record time. And that's from a trade negotiator. You know, I've been sitting in Geneva negotiating agreements that can take decades. And we were able to do it in a very short time with 55 member states participating, and now 49 have signed and ratified the treaty. So the real question now is, how do we implement this trade agreement? And I think the question you posed is very relevant. How do we implement it at a time when there is more skepticism about free trade than there ever was in the world. And we have to take that skepticism seriously, because trade in itself was never, as David Ricardo said, that it always increased welfare and prosperity. Trade always created costs and benefits. It always, created some advantages for some people, and it created injury in other countries. And the question was always about how you manage this, how you create the necessary adjustment mechanisms. And therefore, when I thought a lot about this in the last few years, and as I wrote my book about developmental regionalism, I thought, how do we ensure that all the countries on the continent benefit? And how do they manage this adjustment? And the only way it seemed to me that it was possible was if we didn't focus solely on trade, that we complemented the trade integration with industrial value chains, cross-border infrastructure, and strengthening of institutions on the African continent. So that's the sort of development-driven approach that we will have to adopt if we want this, agreement to succeed. Now, there are ways in which it can be done, which are not so difficult. So one of the things we have to remind ourselves is that the founding fathers of the European Union, also believed that the way in which integration can succeed, where you have uneven, levels of development of different countries, is through the concept of solidarity. Now, I'm very happy that South Africa has adopted in its G20 principles the concept of solidarity, equity, and sustainability. Now, if we apply those to the African context and the free trade agreement, then we have to ensure that all of us, large countries, especially like South Africa, but also larger businesses who operate on the African continent, and I won't say anything about Absa, but I can say something about some of the firms I've talked to, like Woolworths, and give a concrete case of how Woolworths goes to Namibia and imports all its fresh produce from South Africa. And of course, the local farmers complain, and the government gets involved, and a negotiation ensues between the government, the local farmers, and Woolworths. And Woolworths sends its experts to Namibia to engage with the farmers. And through a process of negotiation, they agree on a plan to assist those local farmers to meet the necessary quality standards, sustainability that Woolworths requires. And over a 2-year period, they succeeded. And this is a few years ago when I did that study, and I talked to all the stakeholders involved. And I believe now, if you go to a Woolworths store in Namibia, more than 50% of the fresh produce on the shelf will be Namibian. And many of those products are now in their supply chain, so they're moving around the region. So this is one good example of supplier development. And I could think of at least 100 cases where South African companies could do this in different sectors, not just in food, but also in many other industries. Supplier development, wherever you go, build partnerships and see how you can also draw on local capabilities and support local development. Now, let's take this and apply it at a regional level. We did a study over the last 2 years about how we could address the question of apparel. In Africa, there were many discussions here about different industries, and Mkhonza made a compelling case for agro-processing, talking about food. But if you think about apparel and clothing, there was a study done a few years ago which said that in some countries in Africa, about 80% of the clothes worn by people is secondhand. So there's a huge market on the African continent for apparel, but we import secondhand clothes. Now, we have some of the best quality cotton in the world, produced in many countries in Africa, particularly in West Africa. We have a number of countries producing apparel, importing the textiles and exporting it directly into Europe and the United States. And we have a huge gap in the textile industry processing sector. And we engage with businesses from more than 20 countries on the African continent, from Mauritius to Madagascar, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, and Morocco. And these businesses began to visualize a regional value chain, how they could work together to build an industry across the continent and build their competitiveness to produce for the local market, but also compete globally. And we now have a private sector vision for a regional value chain in the clothing textile sector. And I'm hoping that in the next few weeks, with Mkhonza's help, we will launch the first regional value chain on the African continent from, Cape Town to Morocco or to Cairo, and see how this could be, a leading example of how this could be done in many other sectors. And in this way, we will have investment-driven, but industry-driven implementation of the AfCFTA. And just two more words about the implementation. Most of the discussion I heard yesterday and today was about how we implement. And it seems to me that what we have to do is we have to drive the process of implementation through industrial value chains, because everything else will then follow. As those industries begin to build their cooperation and business connections across the continent, they will identify the barriers that need to be addressed, whether they're non-tariff barriers like standards, or whether they're infrastructure challenges, hard infrastructure like roads and ports, or soft infrastructure issues related to customs, or which rules are giving them problems. Is it intellectual property? Is it investment? And how to build in the institutions that are appropriate to support industrialization. So it seems to me we're on the cusp of really taking advantage of a great opportunity that's before us. And thank you to everyone for really beginning to think about the implementation process. And I'm absolutely sure we will be able to succeed where others have failed. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. I think you've also answered some of the questions that I had as follow on. And I would like to bring in Dr. Neva Makgetla now, so just to speak about the issue of regional integration, especially maybe just connecting to one of the solutions that Prof. Faizel has made around the industrial value chain. I think that's quite an interesting one to kind of, we fix as we go. But I just want to know from your perspective how you see the challenges, the risks and opportunities around regional integration.
Cool. So I mean, I think everything I wanted to say has probably been said, so I will just repeat it with different details. I think what's important is the framing, as both Rob and Faizel has said, is that the AfCFTA is, necessary. It is to be celebrated, especially in light of the current chaos with the US. And it's particularly important for South African exports of services and manufacturers, that a very disproportionate share of our manufacturers go to the rest of Africa. But also, as everybody has said throughout the conference, it needs a lot more work, and it needs complementary measures if we want to see it actually lead to an increase in exports. To start with, I think what we maybe could have talked about a bit more is that, as I understand it, Faizel, you will know this better than me, the process we're still negotiating the actual tariff lines, and that's the actual outcomes will depend a lot on how that goes and the regulatory frameworks and so on. And I do think throughout we should be saying, what is the role of research in assisting this kind of engagement and these kinds of complementary measures? The second thing that was noted repeatedly is that if we don't fix our infrastructure and also our border crossing capacity, that arguably a much bigger obstacle to trade within the region is the state of logistics infrastructure than the tariffs, outside of SACU at least. And in addition, you can argue that as South Africans, we still are not really particularly good about saying what are the opportunities in other countries on the continent. How do we break into longstanding supply chains that often go to colonial, to the colonial powers rather than to other African countries? What can we import from the rest of the continent? Because we tend to run a balance of surplus, and also we tend to import commodities and export manufacturers and high-end services, which is exactly what we object to with other people, as Rob was kind of saying. Also for some products, particularly, for instance, pharmaceuticals and food, the regulatory frameworks are very fragmented, and that can make it very hard to engage in trade. I also just want to flag that I think, and this relates to also this issue of how do we talk about broader development issues, that trade can't be seen by itself, that although, like as Rob said, we need the bigger market that Africa provides, it's also a relatively poor market, and that limits its importance. So that, Africa, like China and India, accounts for 18% of the world's population, but it only accounts for 5% of the world's GDP and 3% of global trade. And by the way, 1/6 of that is South Africa by itself. And in fact, if you exclude crude petroleum, we're 1/4 of all of those exports. So we are, very much of a dominant regional power, which is why we're in BRICS. And I think that a particular problem in terms of our own understanding of how we relate to the rest of Africa is that, as Rob was saying, commodity dependence remains a major problem across Africa, as it does for South Africa. We're much more dependent on exports of minerals than other upper middle income countries. But then you also look at, to see some of the risks there, you look at a country like Botswana. Botswana, if you exclude metals and auto, Botswana, which is a tiny country in terms of population, accounts for 10% of our exports of manufacturers. So it's actually a major export trading partner for us. The rapid growth in artificial diamonds means that its main income source is in jeopardy. And that's what happens when you depend on commodities. You're always at risk. That could totally affect our exports and manufacturers outside of autos and metals. So I think that, as everybody's been saying, if we focus only on expanding exports to the rest of the continent, we're going to miss the boat. That we need to say, how can we promote economic growth in the rest of the continent, and not just pursue our own short-term interests? And that experience also shows, in fact, that if all we look at is expanding trade, that always benefits the countries that are already more advanced in terms of their industrialization at the cost of the other countries. So it can actually increase the inequalities within the region. And while we as South Africa would certainly benefit in the short run, experience is also that you end up with pushback, and that can lead to the end of this kind of trade union. And look at what happened in East Africa, for instance, where the East African communities faced severe strains over the role of Kenya, because if you have just a free trade agreement, that's what happens. And we've already seen cases where, for instance, even within SACU, Botswana and Namibia have put tariffs on some kinds of South African exports because they feel they can't compete, and they will never be able to compete if they cannot protect their own infant industries. But I think the biggest problem for us is that we're in a relatively poor region, and we need to promote that growth across that region if we want to grow ourselves. So if you look at the other BRICS, all of the BRICS are regional powers. If you look at the ratio of our GDP per person to the ratio of our neighbors' GDP per person, it's 5 or 6 to 1. With the other BRICS, it's around under 2 to 1. And in fact, India is actually poorer than its neighbors. So in effect, we don't have that bigger market we expect, but also it means that when it comes to developing infrastructure, when it comes to supporting industries in the ways that Rob and Faizel were talking about, we have to bear a bigger burden by ourselves, because the region doesn't have other partners that we could work with to achieve our mutual aims. So I think it's really important that we see this as being possibly sometimes developing regional value chains does require trade-offs, because what our experience is that anytime we say we want to promote growth in neighboring countries, there will be producers in South Africa who say you're taking away our opportunities to export. Or you might, even if we're not exporting now, we might do it in the future. And Faizel, I don't know if you remember, but I remember very clearly a fight about clothing at NEDLAC once, where I was representing COSATU and I had a mandate to complain about imports of clothing from neighboring countries. And Faizel's going, what were we fighting for all those years if we're going to ice out our neighbors on the continent? But I think that happens all the time. We can see it now with poultry. You know, we can see it now with a variety of goods that we export. And when we go into these negotiations, we will be under pressure. You know, much less even far from looking at how we can develop our neighbors, we're going to be under pressure to say we have to maintain our own tariffs and fight for lower tariffs in neighboring countries. And I think we need to be really clear that there will be trade-offs, and we have to deal with them in terms of the longer-term aim of our own development, and that requires development of the region. Because otherwise we will never achieve the levels of growth that we hope to achieve and the levels of development that we need. And I do think in that context, the role of research and the kinds of research that we try to do as tips in terms of trying to show what are the benefits that we can get from a broader industrialization process. What are the options? Where can we collaborate more? That's the kind of thing we have to work on more. And coming up with that kind of policy-oriented research, I think the more people in this room continue to do the kinds of work they're doing with a really close understanding of the policy requirements, the more helpful that will be. And in the long term, hopefully we all end up someplace better.
Thanks, Doc. So I'm going to be starting to take some questions, and those online are also invited to post some questions. But as a banker, you know that this question couldn't have slipped me. I'm going to direct it to Prof. Rob Davies, but any of the panelists can talk about. So, Prof, you mentioned, you know, us getting loans from overseas, etc., and you know those will still even kill us, even if it's soft loans. More from an exchange rate perspective. I just wanted to hear your views and thoughts on just currencies in general on the continent. Is there maybe perhaps a solution that we can have to allow us to trade more with less friction, if I can call it that, and have less reliance on hard currencies?
I think I would say that those kind of arrangements need to evolve organically. I think, you know, for example, at some level, we might be able to deal with the diversification of imports into Africa if we were a customs union. But the costs of negotiating a customs union and the benefits of achieving that, I think, are just way out of sync. And that, you know, too often, I think African integration arrangements have fallen because the form has actually been more evident than the substance. And so, you know, calling yourself a common market or a customs union, I think the SACU, by the way, is a real customs union. Other things I think that are called themselves economic unions and stuff like that are not quite when you dig down deep at the real level in the definition of that. And I think that's one mode of thinking about regionalism. That's the sort of the classic neoclassical ladder of integration, where, you know, you go from a free trade area to a customs union to an economic union, and then eventually a political federation, all of that. So I think that things like monetary union are way off. I mean, when I was in government, we were sitting in SADC. And SADC had some kind of strategic development plan. It was supposed to be a customs union. Can't remember exactly when, by 2012 or something, monetary union by 2016. And it was all based on form, and the heads of state had endorsed this, and so, you know, it couldn't be changed apparently, and whatever. But it was completely and utterly impractical. And there was no real on-the-ground, substantive, real economy development. So I think that the focus now needs to be on the building of regional value chains. That's what it needs to be on. And I think we need to find, I think I was trying to say as well, in this global environment, we need to find more cooperation. because we can use policy tools, for example, and policy tools are going to be essential in my book if we're going to extract more value from our mineral wealth. We're going to be able to do that better if we're all backing each other up. We're going to be able to do better in terms of producing components for renewable energy if we're all localizing and buying from each other. And in that way, I mean, there's some work already been done on autos, by the way, that's sort of saying, well, you know, in this more or less every country of the continent, this is what they could do. This is what each of them could do in the auto value chain. And of course, that takes investment. That takes all sorts of interventions. But I think the important point is that the trade frictions that Neva was talking about become much easier to manage. And I think the biggest issues on those in the continental free trade area at the moment are not about the tariffs; they're around the rules of origin. The rules of origin have not been completed on clothing and textiles, nor they've been completed on autos. And that's the barrier to actual trade in those areas. And I think that the thing would be that those issues can be more easily solved if there is a sense that this is part of a bigger picture where we're all going to benefit, than if it's like a trade-off between, if I give in, then my industry is not going to, my little industry is not going to come to the grow, and the bigger ones are going to wipe us out, and so on. So I think that it's to find more cooperative areas within, as well as cooperation towards the world outside.
Thank you. So if I can just say for a show of hands, okay, I'll take from you, so okay. I'll take from you, so, and then yeah, please just introduce yourself as you ask the question. I've got two hands up. I've got also from the lady. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Tebogo from the AfCFTA Secretariat, but this comment is my own personal comment, not from the Secretariat. Because I used to be in the academia, so I hope you'll allow me to just theorize a bit. And this goes to all of the panelists here. Could it be that we are actually stuck as a continent in the sense of struggling to reconcile trade policy and industrial policy? Because the two, they are not always friends, so to speak. So you have the AfCFTA, but then we are saying the very same foundational tools, the basis of which the AfCFTA is built, that is the trade-related investment measures agreement of the WTO, the import licensing, and I always make mention of this, the same things that we want from those agreements so that we can have local content are actually running contrary to the very basis on which this AfCFTA is made and based, and of course, other regional integration tools. So is it that we are struggling to find a model that can combine the two, and then we can have a model that can satisfy all countries, all let it go? So this is something that I would like to hear your views on. The second point, and the last, is that, and it's a question really, what incentives can be availed for countries under the AfCFTA to precisely coordinate as well as collaborate? We've heard a lot of studies presented and a lot of great insights. And I think from now as a AfCFTA, and I can tell you how things are working now at the AfCFTA, the question that we need to answer is the AfCFTA working? Now, I think we've gone past doing the econometric analysis now. We have the agreement. Sectorally, how far deep should we go? And I think what Professor Faizel, the work that you've done in terms of textiles, how do we convince countries to say there's beneficiation? So that's why I'm talking about, or rather the question is about, what incentives can we put on the table beyond the macroeconomic studies that we normally have, so the incentives for coordination and collaboration between countries? Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Dan Owakeng-Sitile. I recently completed a doctoral studies on trade and investment, where I focus on South Africa's bilateral, the shifting policy of South Africa's bilateral relations, where I focus on the pushback from the Global South and cooperation from the from the Global South. So my question is on the issue of policy shift. We have recently observed in the US, where the US administration has shifted their policy from donor aid to trade, investment, and tariffs. So my question in that regard is, how should South Africa, to what extent should South Africa, the region, and the continent utilize the AfCFTA as a reset button and as a policy shift to what I called disruptive innovation capacity? Because we have seen how 4AR and artificial intelligence has brought new technological capacities. But my focus is, how do we apply those disruptive innovation capacities in terms of policy making, particularly for South Africa, the region and the continent, to ensure that its engagement with the WTO and other strategic partners is geared towards disrupting the rules of the game. Because for the most time, the African continent has been the rule taker. So we need now to start being rule makers ourselves. So my question is, to what extent should we utilize the disruptive innovation capacity in the policy space to make sure that Africa and the continent leverage their position with the WTO and other strategic partners? I hope my question is clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My question is to Professor Faizel. You mentioned supplier development and bringing in SMMEs into the different value chains, and you gave an example of Namibia, where it took about 2 years to actually capacitate local businesses. So there seems to be a skills divide, I think, everywhere. And, you know, it looks like usually we're not really proactive in bringing in skills. We've seen instances, even in South Africa, where opportunity comes and it comes with a sense of urgency, but there isn't enough skills to actually bring in businesses within the value chains. So how would we be able to proactively upskill small businesses so that they're included immediately as businesses come to locate, and in other instances where there are opportunities which are more urgent? My other question to you is around automation and technology. Also touching on small businesses. How do you see the trajectory going forward, even with the regional trade opportunities? Do you think there'll be increasing opportunity when we bring in automation and technology, because with the different systems that operational systems for businesses, we've seen that they require 24/7 operations throughout the week, even weekends and so forth, and that has had a negative impact also with job creation. So what would be a solution in bridging those gaps? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think there was one question that was directed to Prof. Faizel, but the rest were kind of to the panelists. So I'm not sure, Dr. Neva and Rob, which ones you want to take. Oh, it looks like you want to start. That's fine.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. Well, I'll take Mkhonza's question. Yeah, so yes, we have to have some coordination between trade and industrial policy. But that question has to be answered in the concrete, in the very specific context. And of course, it's quite different if you're in a customs union, because if you're in a customs union, you need to have a common trade policy, because you have to have a common tariff, common external tariff. And that means you have to align your industrial policy or you have to find some way of managing it. So there's a big need, if you are a customs union, like we are in SACU. We don't do it very well in SACU, but we are constantly having to engage with each other because we have to have an alignment of industrial policy. But if you're in a free trade agreement, each country can still have its own industrial policy. It can have a different trade policy as well. But the issue that is still controversial, and this is one of the things I think Neva pointed out, which is not resolved still in the negotiations, is the issue of rules of origin. So in a free trade agreement, the way in which you manage your industrial policy is through rules of origin. And what that means is, because you want to prefer African producers, it's Africa first, right? So you want to prefer Africans. You don't want to prefer Europeans or Americans or Chinese or anybody else, third countries, because the whole purpose of a regional arrangement is to prefer your neighbors within the region. So the way to do that and to avoid what we call transshipping, when people bring in goods from outside and then use one country to then enter your market and then take advantage of the free trade agreement without adding any value, is the rules of origin. And the rules of origin says that you've got to add a certain amount of value for your goods to qualify as being African made, as being domestically. And so there is an issue of coordination, and we need to reach agreement. So that's why we're having some challenges in the negotiations, because different countries have different industrial policies, but they have to agree at least on a small thing, which has implications for industrial policy, which is rules of origin. And then after that, there are other things that will, as they drive a regional value chain, that's where the issues of harmonization of standards, because if you're producing, whether it's auto components or, even in textiles, those goods have to move across borders. They must have a common standard. They must have an agreed standard and to move across borders. So then that's where the AfCFTA, we have an agreement on that to harmonize standards. And we also have an agreement in the AfCFTA to deal with issues related to any unfair trade remedies or anti-dumping. And that will then have to be implemented. And of course, we have an agreement in the WTO about disputes and how we deal with disputes. So as we drive industrialization, we then implement. And we implement for different industries. It may be different. Pharmaceuticals, the standards are different. In agriculture, it'll be different. And we don't have to adopt European standards or American standards. We have to adopt standards which are appropriate for the African context and where African countries currently are in their level of development. So that's the same answer I have for the issue of skills. That question can only be answered really in the very concrete context of a particular industry that we are building across the continent. And we have to then think about what sort of skills we need for that industry to develop and to grow. And yes, there are massive opportunities in the new technologies, particularly in the green space. And today we heard about a number of them, whether it's hydrogen or renewables, batteries, and of course in the technology. And already we're seeing many signs of African countries beginning to enter the space of technology. Why? Because they're young. We have a youthful population. Take M-Pesa, which of course in banking, we are on the frontier of that space of banking through cell phones. And this is because of a very youthful population. It's an appropriate technology for an appropriate level of development of African countries. So I think we have to answer those questions in the concrete and take advantage of these new technologies They are disruptive. There will be some job losses, but they are also they're potential creators of new jobs.
Thanks, Prof. So I just want to note that we do need to release Prof. Davies. He has to rush for another appointment.
Yeah, thanks. If I can just also have a crack at the question that was raised by Mkhonza. To start with, I would say it's not really a question of reconciling trade and industrial policy. It's a question of placing industrial policy first, and trade policy must follow and be informed by industrial policy. That's the route that successful industrializers have gone through, where it is industrial policy that shapes your trade policy, not the other way around. So I think that the reality that we've got, though, and I wrote about this, I published a small book in 2019. It's available from the South Center. Call it The Politics of Trade in the Era of Hyperglobalization. I have a small chapter on the CFTA, and I argue that it was actually, I use this quotation from Keynes, that practical men imagine they're under no intellectual influence are often the slaves of some defunct economist. And I said that the practical decisions around the AfCFTA conceal that there were a variety of paradigms that were influencing it. And I think that there is a clear trade integration, or orthodox trade integration paradigm that's present there, reflected in what you say. A lot of things borrowed from WTO and whatever. But the trick is, and the task now is to turn that arrangement, which can be a building block for something different, a tool of industrial development. That's the challenge we've got now. It's not to go and throw it out. It's a question to build on it in a way that supports industrialization. Now you say, how do we do that? What incentives are there to cooperate and coordinate? I think the first kind of incentive that there isn't available is someone playing Father Christmas. There's no one around who's going to throw money around and mobilize everybody that way. It's not going to work. It's not. There's no one able to play that role. So it's going to have to be in the design of the policies and programs that are done in such a way that everybody sees there is something in it for them, and that it's worth pursuing that rather than continue to exist in the fragmented way which we are at the moment, and in the way of producing and exporting primary products. It's going to have to be in the design of the policies and programs, and it's going to have to be something that is called for by peoples of the countries concerned, because they see the value of that. I think one ingredient that perhaps we do need to really, really reflect on is the leadership champions that are going to do this. I mean, I personally, and just to put it up, I'm very, very happy with the way that the Secretary General of the AfCFTA is acting and trying to position the organization. I think that vision needs to also be championed much more energetically at a higher level. And I think that supporting, sometimes the industrial policy tools are going to, at this stage of integration, necessarily be deployed at national level, but with some level of coordination and some level of understanding of the broader evolution of the value chain. I think that's the way we're going to go. And I think that South Africa has to learn that we cannot treat the AfCFTA mercantilistically. We cannot just go there and say, here we are, we produce more finished goods than the rest of you, so that we must just drop all our finished goods off with everybody else. We've also got to learn the value of investment-led trade on the rest of the continent. Because if we don't, well, the market won't grow, and we'll get retaliation from everybody else. I say, oh, I'd rather take the Chinese goods. I'd rather take the whatever comes in from wherever, Dubai or whatever. That's the thing. Now, the other question I thought was relevant was, well, I'm going to respond to, is that can we use the AfCFTA to disrupt the rules in ways that are going to benefit ourselves? I think that was the gist of the question. And I want to say that I think absolutely that we're beginning to recraft rules. I would make a reference to the AfCFTA protocol on investment. which I think is very different from the the contents of the bilateral investment treaties, because in addition to raw power, I think that countries that are still caught in these, and I was very happy that in my time in government we lapsed these things. But these bilateral investment treaties, a lot of African countries are finding themselves taken by European to these and getting big awards and so on. And the Continental Free Trade Area Protocol is a different way of looking at the question of investment, the right to regulate, the obligation to invest in renewable industries and things like that, I think are a new way of looking at rules in this kind of area. So I think we need a lot more of that. Of course, it only covers our own investments by ourselves in each other. It doesn't cover the investments that we all have with or the rest of the world has in us. But I do think that it is important that we should be starting to forge a different rule book, because I don't think that, my own take is, I think that multilateralism and a set of institutions and practices that generally emerges from a crisis. I think that the existing multilateralism is in decline, while there's contestation to shape an as yet not in existence multipolar arrangement. We don't have the multilateralism that goes with multipolarism yet. And I think that what's going to happen is going to take some time to get there. And so I don't think that expecting the WTO to do it or anything like that is going to yield anything, although I think we should be present in all the debates in the WTO and make sure that reform does not go the other way, that reform for inclusivity and development is put very firmly on the agenda. But I don't think with big expectations. I think we should be drawing our rules within the CFTA. That's what I would say on that issue. That was a general set of questions, so I think I'm entitled to answer those two.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of our session. Apologies to the two ladies that wanted to ask some questions, but hopefully we can still keep Dr. Neva and Prof. Faizel for lunch, and so you can ask your questions there. We still want to do a quick photo shoot, but before that, I need to call up Dr. Tebogo Makube, please, to come and do a closeout for us. Just some words of some closing remarks. He is the Chief Director at Industrial Procurement at the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition. If I can please ask you, sir, to come up and give us the closing remarks.
Fellow board members, eminent panelists, and former minister, colleagues, thank you very much for attending this forum, which is enlightening. I've been given the easiest job, so to officially close the conference, but I've listened to thought-provoking discussions. So tomorrow is the 1st of August. So we all know the impact of the 1st of August. And this forum is very critical in responding to the 1st of August, and which is less than 12 hours to come. So the issue is, how can Africa, in particular South Africa, respond to the challenge? So John Stewart at Tralac in 2022 wrote an article of whether the AfCFTA can drive the regional value chains, or the regional value chains drive the AfCFTA? I think it's a very thought-provoking question, you know, and similarly, the questions have been asked here, whether are we as Africans doing enough to respond mainly, one, to the challenge of growth, to the challenge of poverty. Do we have trade comparability? Because that's a key element of regional value chains. So we are all resource-based economies. We are not efficient in managing those resources. The responsibility is on us to drive growth, to build the better future for us and the next coming generation. Now, I like to raise two important sectors with regards to regional value chains. So if you look at Absa, who owns Absa? Go and look at who owns Absa. It's governments in Europe. How is Absa built? Through components. Components are sourced all over the world, but mostly in Europe. In South Africa, we used to supply components to Absa. So that is the global value chain, but mostly it's designed around the regional value chains. The building of submarines. So Absa is French mostly, but they source components in Europe. Submarines, mostly German, but the sourcing of components is Europe. How is Africa doing? We are now focusing on critical minerals. How are we mining the critical minerals? Are we processing the critical minerals? The issue that the minister is raising, from pit to international markets, is still the same. So we have the responsibility. The IDC itself is now investing in, for instance, in lithium mining in Namibia, so that we begin to bring in action to the issue of regional value chains. So it's important, colleagues, that we don't only research, we have the responsibility as practitioners to also bring in those investments around the continent. If the tariffs come through tomorrow, what will be the impact of the textile industry in Lesotho, for instance? And if we don't invest in countries like Lesotho as South Africans, then we are not going to resolve the issue of migration. If we don't support the sugar industry in Swaziland and processing it here and other countries, we are not going to resolve the issue of migration. So there are multiplier effects, negative multiplier effects of not implementing the regional value chains. So that is very important for us. I don't want to touch the aerospace again. If you look at the strategy of Emirates, Emirates has taken the market share from South African Airways. It's now flying directly to Zimbabwe and other African countries, whereas before people would used to fly from Zimbabwe, Johannesburg, and international. So we have lost that. Countries are not waiting, they are taking the market share. So the time to talk is done. Let's act. Thank you very much and enjoy your night.